Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and I am just delighted to introduce you to our guest, Mark Joseph, author of Root of Rock Gets Religion, The Battle for the Soul of the Devil's Music. Mark is a multimedia producer who has worked as a music and film producer, columnist, talk show host, and author, having produced the official soundtrack for The Passion of the Christ and anchored the entertainment report for Group W and CNN. Mark is well connected and well versed in rock and roll and the ways religion has impacted its many stars. Mark Joseph, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Thanks for having me.
Mark, let's talk about your faith, your journey, and what would plug you into tapping into what back in the days of Elvis really stimulated this call that this was the devil's music. What's your story, kind of giving our audience insight into your life?
Sure. I mean, I grew up in a culture in which, secularism prevailed. And I often joke about, even if you go back and look at a show like I Love Lucy, it's very interesting. I encourage your viewers to go back and check it out because it's an incredibly secular show, believe it or not. You never see, think about it for a second. You have Lucille McGillicuddy, I'm guessing she's Irish, and you have Ricky Ricardo, Cuban. An Irish and a Cuban couple getting together, my bet is that they're Catholic. But you would never know it from watching that show. There's no moments of mass. There's no priest coming over. There's no baby dedications. Whatever it might be, it doesn't exist on that show as far as I can tell. And that's really an example of the secularization of American pop culture. Now, that's not a bad show, nothing wrong with it. But our mass media for about 50 years pretended we were not a religious people, and there was this vociferous attempt to keep any kind of faith out of media. And so that's the group, the setting that I came of age in. And I grew up in a very religious household. My parents were missionaries. My father was a pastor, and I just kind of wondered, why am I not seeing normal religious life in media? And that got me to ask a lot of questions and of course, make my own media. I produced the soundtrack for The Passion of the Christ and have worked on a lot of movies. But that really got me thinking about what are the forces that seem so intent on keeping religion out of public life, and why do they do it? And is that necessary, or can our media be honest and truthful, and can it reflect the normal lives that we lead? Not necessarily in a proselytizing way, but just in a normal way. We often talk about we've got to keep our movies real. Well, we really haven't been. We pretend we're France. We're really more like Ireland, actually, as a country in terms of our religious fervor.
It's interesting that you talk about the television in the home. It was through the television that the first nighttime soap opera called Soap was introduced into the American living room, and a character played by Billy Crystal, who was the first homosexual to be introduced into the family home, that kind of gave the family a reason to be able to now talk about Weird Uncle Eddie and make it normal, if you would, because it was now in the living room and it was now a topic of conversation. And we see that a number of society's standards have been introduced in a very subtle way through situation comedy or through now the media, through news, mainstream news, or through cable news, of what that influence has been. And you've seen that with your own eyes. And when you look at life through somewhat of a biblical worldview, it becomes apparent to you that some of the messaging of the movies, some of the messaging of the music, the lyrics, the antics, the drug culture, the deaths, the popularity, the role models of the generation that I grew up in, born in the early 50s, we had different kind of influences, and they weren't religious influences. I grew up in the Jewish community of Pittsburgh, and my influences were the Grateful Dead, Steppenwolf, Chicago, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. You know, if I wanted to go classical, it was Van Cliburn. It wasn't Beethoven. Then it went to Van Halen instead of Van Cliburn, and you know, you moved. You just kind of migrated through, and Campus Crusade for Christ passed me by completely. I didn't even know they existed. Jesus was the God of the Gentiles. I was a Jew. Go have your fun, we have our fun. And we loved rock and roll. We were a generation that was fired up by the lyrics and by the John Lennons and by the Rolling Stones and Zeppelin and the Grateful Dead, and the message that was contained therein, which was civil. Make a change in society by changing society. Faith was not a component. So even though you heard the reference point that, you know, Elvis is singing the devil's music, it had no meaning. It had no base of reference to Northeastern or Midwestern or Pittsburgher, Jew from Pittsburgh. What did that mean? It was meaningless, but it was impacting a lot of lives.
Yeah, I think that I think back on why would an executive at the I Love Lucy show make these kinds of decisions, and I think it's not necessarily all out of malice. It could have been, hey, we don't want to be divisive. We don't know if we should be Lutheran or Baptist or Catholic, and it also could have been that the Protestants are not going to like the fact that Lucy and Ricky go to Mass every week. Whatever, there are all kinds of reasons, but there were also very definitely strongly secular forces who did not like religion, did not want it to be part of mass media culture, and really made an effort. And in my book, in particular, in Rocket's Religion, I identify there's a review from 1973. I believe it was Rolling Stone, and there's a very devout religious record called by a guy named Milo Lefevre. And, just the pejoratives they used to describe that record, it was just astounding. And I forgot what the exact wording was, it's in the book, but really just shocking the way they put him down. They talked about this guy is obsessed with this effing ghost Jesus. And just really made their best effort to keep it away.
Was this, was rock and roll by its design to be countercultural and to be the agenda and the platform for an agenda that would ultimately lead us down a path of really being able to considering a godless society, and even the lyrics of the songs, the music, the whole environment was the normalization of a drug culture, the normalization of a rebellion. I was part of the post-Holocaust generation, a part of the baby boomers, kind of this merging of, we were antithetical to our Eastern European ancestors. We were vocal, we were intelligent, we were educated, we had a voice, and our parents did not share that voice, and our grandparents weren't allowed to have a voice because of the persecution that they faced. So this was the birth of it's almost like when people would ask me where was I when Kennedy got shot, I started saying, am I a suspect? Why do you keep asking me that question? We saw culture change.
I think rock and roll is basically neutral as an art form. I mean, you can get into scientific arguments about does it make plants, grow poorly or not. But I think as a general rule, it's fairly neutral and it can be utilized. It can be aggressive. Heavy metal is an aggressive form of music, but that could help people in battle, for all I know. So I think it's generally a neutral art form, but it's how that aggression is channeled or how those instincts are channeled. And I think, frankly, I think religious leaders made a big mistake in sort of ceding that ground and saying, "Well, this is the devil's music," when I don't think it is. Alice Cooper, who wrote the foreword of the book, is the best example of a guy who's very devout. He was an alcoholic and he changed his ways, and now he plays golf and talks to God instead of talking to the bottle. His turned around. He changed his lyrics, and now he sings in a way that honors his faith and honors God. So I do think a strategic mistake was made, and I think it was understandable. Imagine being a parent or a religious leader in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, and you don't know what's going on. You see that rock and roll has this powerful sway over people. You see girls at an Elvis concert and a Beatles concert going crazy, and you're threatened by this. It's almost threatening to the power structure of religious leaders themselves. And so the response was an overreaction. Instead of saying, this is a powerful medium, how can we utilize this, or how can we be a part of this? They just wrote it off as the devil's music and saw the negative influences that it was bringing in. But I think it took a generation or so. And one of the themes of the book, parenthetically, is the change in the religious leader's tone, and in particular Alice Cooper. So you had people like Elvis, whose pastor essentially said to him, "You've got to choose between rock and roll and God. There's no way to combine this." Now, fast forward 30 years, and you have Alice Cooper's pastor. So Alice has this transformational experience, goes to his preacher and says, "What do I do now?" And I know what he was thinking. He's thinking, do I cut my hair, go back to my given name of Vincent Fernier, and sing "God Bless America" at churches around the country, which would have lost all his fans, of course. But his pastor wisely says to him, he asked him a question. He gave a question response to his question. He says, "Does God make mistakes?" And Alice says, "Well, I don't think so." And his pastor says, "Well, he made you to be Alice Cooper. So go out there and be the most God-honoring Alice Cooper you can be. Don't suddenly change the persona that God arranged for you to have." That's a really key distinction and a difference in the quality and the nature of the leadership that these rock stars were getting from their pulpits, from the pulpits of the churches they attended.
Should we merge genre or musical segment? I mean, Satan himself was the praise and worship leader of heaven, the most gifted of. He was the arch cherubim, more beautiful, more wise, and all the angels sang. So here you have this heavenly tabernacle choir led by one who would ultimately fall. And then to give him the attribution that he is the father, he's called the father of lies, but he's not called the father of rock and roll in the Bible. He's not the father of contemporary Christian music or country music or bluegrass music or any of that in a modern day attribution except for what man wants to apply to him. So we have to break it down to the person, to the message, and to the model. And we have a couple of those. You looked at Prince, Madonna, Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston. My goodness, here's Whitney Houston comes out of the church, fully devoted to the Lord, gets involved with someone who takes her down. There's no question that somebody led her down a path of destruction and cost her life. Was Whitney Houston under a demonic influence in her relationship with this man who introduced her to drugs? Does that diminish her contribution to what she did in the church and to her faith? And who are we to judge in these cases? But for the grace of God, there go I. But then we take a look at this hype of, and I don't know if we agree or disagree on this matter, but coming out of Judaism, the embracing of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism of the Madonnas and the Britney Spears, and making it something so super spiritual to build a following, or Madonna to name herself or to create herself in the image of this Catholic icon of one to be worshipped, the mother of Jesus, is just theatrics to me. Here's what some of the reviewers said. Some you may know: Phil Kigge. Mark Joseph's research in the lives and accomplishment of artists reveals the roots of faith and the diverse detours that lie ahead for those pursuing their dreams. Lead singer of Stryper, Michael Sweet, says Rock Gets Religion is a first-hand look at the power of music and the effect it can have on a dark and desperate world when it delivers a message of hope, grace, love, and peace. We're going to be right back after these announcements. Back. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our 1-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Mark Joseph, author of Rock Gets Religion, The Battle for the Soul of the Devil's Music. Mark, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Mark, on the back of the book, there's a quote here that says, Rock Gets Religion is a first-hand look at the power of music and the effect it can have on a dark and desperate world when it delivers a message of hope, love, grace, and peace. And this is written by Michael Sweet, lead singer of Stryper. So is rock and roll evil?
No, I think rock and roll is like almost everything else in life. It can go either way. It's neutral. It's like us. You know, we can be great people who reach our potential, or we can be people who sink to the abyss and follow our base instincts and go off in strange directions. So, yeah, I think more and more, and again, as I said in the earlier segment, I think religious leaders made a strategic mistake in seeing rock as the enemy instead of a potential friend. You know, every musical note was created by, if you believe, created by the God of the universe, and he didn't give up a certain portion of music and say, well, that's off limits, and I don't do that style. And so you talked earlier about, you know, the band Third Day, and you know, this brings up a really good example for your listeners who are not already Christians. Third Day is you know, one of the biggest Christian rock bands in the country, but from my perspective, Third Day is a rock band. And I think it's been a great loss to our culture, the fact that most Americans have no idea who Third Day is, and they've never heard this incredible singer named Mac Powell, who was one of the great vocalists of our time. And that's one of my motivations for writing the book, because as I would meet more and more bands like Third Day, they don't, you know, no artist that I know of in the morning and says, I only want to sing for 24% of the population in my career and in this day ahead of me. That's ridiculous. Every artist, every communicator wants to reach as many people as humanly possible. They don't want to be segmentized and into a little niche market. And yet, what I discovered in my reporting was that primarily it was the music executives, the marketing folks, who kept cornering these guys into a niche and kept keeping their music just for this group over here. In my first book, this is the third in this of books. My first book, I compared contemporary Christian music to the old Negro baseball leagues they used to call them back then. And what I realized was, you know, it wasn't just racist white guys who were keeping blacks out of Major League Baseball. It was also the owners of the Negro baseball leagues, because they had an arrangement. They liked the racist arrangement because it kept their league going. And once Jackie Robinson crossed over, the need for that league disappeared and it quickly closed up shop. And that's what I was seeing in the pop music world. I saw executives who were intent, Christian executives, who were intent on keeping these artists in Christian music and did not want them to cross over to the wider culture because their gig would be up. And that's a shame. And so in the book, I talk in a number of places about artists like Phil Keaggy and Randy Stonehill and some of these amazing artists in the 70s. I talk about a song, remember when Eric Clapton wrote Tears in Heaven?
Yes.
Well, what you may not know, if you're not an evangelical Christian attending your megachurch, is that Dana Key wrote a response song called Dear Mr. Clapton. that began, "Dear Mr. Clapton, I have heard of your loss." Wow, the response song is almost as beautiful as the original, and yet the culture never heard it. Nobody ever knew about that song. And so we have a generation of artists whose brilliance was wasted, primarily, again, because of the kind of a collusion of short-sighted Christian music guys who wanted to keep this music in their little niche, as well as secularists who didn't really want to give these guys a platform. And that's a shame.
So then you have this thing called MTV come along. You have a couple of other, I'm not unfortunately familiar with them, but then you have this real divide between what's going to become video, rock video, and hip hop and things like that. And then you have over here contemporary Christian music, and now it's almost divisive. And you have Nashville and Branson. Then you have L.A., and it's almost a war of the music cities for what's going to be the genre.
Right.
Then you have the rappers coming out of what's that town in California? Not Stockton, but
Compton.
Compton. There you go, Compton. When the rapper that I knew was a guy named 50 Shekel. All right? 50 Shekel was a Tel Aviv Jewish rapper that came to faith in Jesus and went back to his original given name as Aviad Cohen. He passed away last year, but once he came to the Lord, he changed his music to be about Yeshua, Jesus, and the Jewish world rejected this icon. Then you have somebody like Matisyahu, a Jewish rapper, the Rapping Rabbis, and things like that. That a whole new genre of music coming out of Israel, which is phenomenal. Right. Just incredible music coming out of Israel. And they don't fit into any American schema because they're all things. They're a cappella, they're rock, they're rabbis, long hair, black coats, big hats with electric guitars, and they're rocking out old Hebrew songs. And people don't know what to make of it because it doesn't fit. America, and I guess really London, with the exception of ABBA, the anomaly from another country, but the London rock and roll, the American rock and roll scene seemed to have set the pattern for what this was. And here we were, a Judeo-Christian country, and we refused to allow this expression. If it's not framed as a sonnet or a poet, it's not, or poetry, it's not literature. That's tantamount to saying that the great novels are irrelevant, or tantamount to saying that biographies are irrelevant because they're not a poet, they're not poetry, and they're not a sonnet, and not Byron. And if it's not Byron, then it's just not literature. This is what we've done to the genre of music, saying that there's not freedom of expression, and because my lyrics are loud, but they're loud about Jesus, should I be concerned it falls in the category of rock and roll? And are they rejecting an identity of contemporary Christian music? And because they're not a contemporary Christian music, do my parents filter my kids from hearing it because it bears the label of rock and roll? And you shatter many of those stigmas in the book. Help us understand why we need to break down some of these labels in all areas of our life, but especially in this understanding that this is not the devil's music.
Yeah, look, I think part of this, there's something in the evangelical American Christian character that says, if I can't get my way, I'm going to go home. Mm-hmm. And there's, it's, in other words, did Christian pop and rock stars in the 70s and 60s face some persecution? Sure. Persecution is a relative term. Did they face some hostility? Of course. Did some record labels try to get them to water down their content? Of course. That's life in the real world. And so sometimes I feel like there's an impulse of, well, then I'm just going to go home and create my own genre because they won't let me sing about my faith. Well, life in the naked pop, it used to be called the naked public square, is messy. There's give and take. You can't always get everything you want. You will do the best you can. You don't take your marbles and go home.
Right.
And by the way, you talked earlier about the gay community. They've done a masterful job that I think the evangelicals would be well to emulate in the way they've got themselves into pop culture and been a part of the narrative of mainstream culture. I often will hear Christian artists say, "Well, we can't do that on a major network because they would never let us have a religious movie." Well, the gay community doesn't think like that. They say this: we're Americans, we're in pop culture, we're going to have a TV show on major networks, Will and Grace, Modern Family, whatever it might be. They're very confident, and whereas I see Christians say, "Fine, we'll just go create our own network that nobody else will watch except for our home team." And so, part of being an American, our pop culture thrives when everybody throws in and everybody pushes and pulls and tugs and tries to get their message across, and you don't give up and go home and start your own nonprofit network. And that's, I think, the impulse that Christians have got to fight. Imagine if Christians thought that way in politics. Imagine if they said, we can't get our policies through the real Congress, so let's create a pretend Christian Congress down the street. It'll be the same kind of building. We'll elect our own representatives. We'll vote to outlaw this and that. Now, they won't actually take effect, but we'll feel really good about the fact that we banned this and banned that. Well, that you would say that's crazy. But that's the equivalent of what Christians have done in media. They've created their own pretend pop culture parallel to the real one, but it has very little impact on the primary one.
What is your take on the rappers, the marginalization, that all of its hate, all of its anti-police, all of it is in this category of all. We seem to throw these labels around and condemn greatly, and then parents put their kids in a bubble, and they eventually go out in the world and decide for themselves what they want and what they don't want, what they like and what they don't like. My parents didn't want me to go to a Grateful Dead concert or to a Led Zeppelin concert, so I waited until I went off to college and went to all of them. And we had Woodstock, and we had a great time, at these events. And at the same time, the Jesus movement is birthed. How does that happen if everybody is brainwashed into the devil's music? How does the greatest season of revival in modern time get birthed concurrent with the growth of rock and roll? If it were that overwhelming, then Azusa Street could have never happened. The Jesus movement of the 70s could have never happened if this was the greatest influence in the world. So have we demonized something that should not be demonized?
Yeah, in the book I talk about hip-hop. There is a very strong Christian presence in hip-hop right now. Kendrick Lamar is an example. Lecrae, the number one record in the country last year, by a very, very devout artist who is strongly influenced by the theologian John Piper. There are a number of artists. Now, here's the thing. These are very different artists. Lecrae is, very theologically informed. Kendrick Lamar and Chance the Rapper, these are guys that were raised in the Christian community. Now, significantly, there's a different narrative, by the way, in the Black Gospel African American community over the years than the one we talked about earlier. Now, this one is a bit more of it goes back to artists like Sam Cooke, where, again, Sam Cooke kind of falls away from gospel and into pop music, and he's seen as having fallen away, right? And the way that he passes away is a warning to young artists, don't go the R&B path, stay on the gospel track. And so there was this dualism. But that's broken down over time by people like Kirk Franklin, even by Al Green, who begins to, Al Green makes secular records, then Christian records, and then later he figures out I can be myself. You know, part of being myself. It's funny. I used to work with Andre Crouch quite a bit before he passed away, and one day I asked him. I said, "How come you never wrote songs about girls?" And he, with a twinkle in his eye, he said, "Well, how do you know some of those songs that I wrote about God weren't actually about a girl?" I thought that was interesting, that he didn't really feel the freedom to say, this song is about Susie. But in his heart of hearts, he was a human being. He had love for God and also maybe love for a girl. And so that's all been changing now. Now, these artists, if you go through these lyrics of Kendrick Lamar, Chance the Rapper, some of them are rough. But there's no doubt they're wrestling with their identity, their Christian faith, and how to express it. And so shockingly, there obviously are some things in hip hop and rock that are not good from a parent's perspective, but in hip hop there's quite a resurgence now of open expressions of faith, but not a white megachurch polite Sunday kind of expressions of faith. These are very raw. These are people that have lived in rough situations, and their faith is correspondingly rough, and their expressions are correspondingly rough. But that's okay. They're working through their faith with fear and trembling.
We've often seen that there are certain genres of music which embrace what we would consider to be curse words, swear words, street words, vernacular, which is not something that would roll off the tongue of a minister, a rabbi, or even someone that considered themselves to be an evangelical Christian, that they would season their wording. Do the lyrics determine the genre? Does the delivery determine the genre? Or does the world, the producer, does the label, are they the ones? Is this just a marketing aspect of what is contemporary Christian music, and why is Third Day not rock? Or is Third Day contemporary Christian music? Is Third Day rock and contemporary Christian music combined and bridges the gap between the two? How does this arbitrary system work, and how has we of a culture bought into it? Because Elvis Presley came out of the church, and yet because of his hips, this dance move was the offensive, alluring part that got him condemned as doing the devil's work, because even if he sang Amazing Grace, at the end of it, there would always be the signature throw of the hip. What most people don't know is that if you look closely at pictures of Elvis Presley, he's wearing a Star of David, because his mother was Jewish, and his dead twin brother Aaron, who he took on his name as Elvis Aaron Presley, is an amazing story of Elvis, the Jewish believer, who always honored his Jewish faith by wearing a Star of David. But nobody ever talks about any of these stories because they want to, everybody either loves Elvis or he was the icon for the devil's music because he had those sexy, alluring hips. Who gets to brand?
Yeah.
Who gets to brand them?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to move away from that idea that your lyrics create a genre. Otherwise, we're going to have an endlessly segmentized society where there's, our Donnie and Marie Mormon pop music. It's endless. So I think the answer to your question is, genres are based on musical styles, period, paragraph, end of sentence. Third Day is a rock band. Matisyahu is not a Jewish rapper, but a rapper. And a style of music. Hip hop is a style of music. Again, I pin the blame on the really, it's a marketing decision. This became very clear, by the way. There was a band called Jars of Clay, which you may remember.
Sure.
Now, Jars of Clay had a pop hit called Flood, which made them instant pop stars. And then the Christian music world they were a part of, I'm not sure they were crazy about that. And I remember there were battles going on where The band, again, remember, put yourself in the shoes of an artist. An artist wants to be heard. So the band asked Walmart, please stock us in the section, the J's, jars of clay, not in the Christian section. The label would call Walmart and say, please stock our artist in the Christian section. So you literally had the band and the label at war with each other, cross purposes. One, simply trying to make it a more comfortable buying experience for a Christian to easily go to the Christian section. The band, I think, logically saying, well, Christians understand the alphabet too. They can find us in the J's. And that pretty much epitomizes what was going on. And on a similar scale, similar note, the band POD, Payable on Death, a band of devout Christians signed with Atlantic Records, they used to tell the story about some of their fans who went to heard them on a tour with Ozzy Osbourne's group, went to the record store to buy the CD, and they were told that CD is in the gospel section. Well, you know, if you're a 19-year-old kid with a nose ring who just went to see Ozzy and POD play, you're not really looking for the Gaither section, the gospel section, and that would say, well, I guess we don't want that then. So this is the nub of the problem. And by the way, now it's happening in my business, in the film industry, where there's a concerted effort to start a separate faith-based film industry that's almost walled off from the normal film industry. Many of the same players, but also many of the same mistakes that are being made. And I hope we can avoid the next 30 years of having now these filmmakers silenced as their forebears in music were silenced.
You know, and that's an area that we're heavily involved in, working with Ben Lauro and the people over at Pure Publicity, Pure Flicks, working with Nisi Davies and Ben Davies and the Irwin brothers and the Kendrick brothers, and the people are producing some of these great films. And you know, your work on the Passion of the Christ is just extraordinary, and that was something that might not have been and may not continue to be, and Jim Caviezel may not have been, and the whole perception of actors in this space. You know, Charlton Heston became famous for playing Moses, and Yul Brynner became famous for playing Moses, and no longer is that a mantle of honor. It's actually a segmented, you're to be ostracized because you go against the grain of the Marxist, socialist, Hollywood agenda, which says that you have to be all-inclusive for all people, and if you even say you're a Christian, you have to be a homophobe, a xenophobe, an Islamophobe, and all those things just because you believe in God and His sacrifice of Jesus for our sins. So, is your book for the rock aficionado? Is your book for the pastor, youth pastor, who's saying, hey, I'm conflicted in the music I want to bring into my church, and my kids are going outside. They're doing an end run on me, and their parents don't know anything about what they're doing or what they're listening to. They got the headphones in. The parents have no clue. They've given them access, and there's lots of access out there, so they have no clue what's going into their ears. Is this going to take this out of the darkness that it's been in and bring it out into the light where it needs to be, to begin to evoke a dialogue and a narrative that's new, vibrant, and contemporary in regards to what forms of messaging? Is it the form that it's rock, or it's country, or it's blues, or it's jazz? Does that really matter in this big scheme of things, or is it the message? Is that what we need to be focusing on?
Yeah, I think if you're a parent or a youth pastor, as you say, this book will be very informative. You'll find artists in here that you had no idea that they were devout Christians, for instance. I think of bands like 21 Pilots that most people have no clue, or The Fray, or really Mumford & Sons, dozens and dozens and dozens of artists. You know, even Taylor Swift, Justin Bieber, These are artists that have a background in the church. Taylor Swift is a homeschooled kid. Justin Bieber's mother, very devout Christian pro-life activist. And in the book, I have a funny scene in which Justin Bieber is on The View, or is being taken up on The View. And the old ladies on The View are horrified that he's expressed opposition to abortion, and they're trying to, essentially counsel the young rock star of why he should not be pro-life. And yet, Justin Bieber, being the product of a teenage unwed mom, has certain views on that topic because of what he experienced. And so I just thought that was a fun moment in pop culture history when the tables are turned and the old ladies are scolding the young pop star because he's pro-life, something that would have been hard to imagine 50 years ago. So there's a lot of great stories in here. It took me about 12 years to put this book together. A lot of the artists I know personally and incorporated their stories, and as well as just doing a ton of research and being surprised myself. I didn't really realize the magnitude and the scale of this thing, of just how many devout Christians and a few Jewish artists too, by the way. I talked in an earlier book about Evan and Jaron, two Jewish brothers, twins, I believe. And very interesting because they would not play on the Sabbath. Well, imagine you're the manager of a band that won't play on the Sabbath, the Jewish Sabbath. Now you got a real problem because, most concerts are on the weekends. And so there are a lot of unique challenges that are faced. But I admire artists like Evan and Jaron and Matisyahu and others. And so it's not just a Christian story, and there also is a very strong Jewish component to what's been happening as well.
Well, there you have it. We've been talking with Mark Joseph, author of Rock Gets Religion, The Battle for the Soul of the Devil's Music. If you're wondering what your kids are listening to, whether or not it's right, wrong, good, bad, it's not a matter of whether or not it's country or contemporary Christian music. It's a matter of the message, and it's always been a matter of the message. And what reaches your kids and this generation and the generation that came before it is different than what reached our generation. And it's clear that there were many artists during the 50s, 60s, and 70s who had an anti-establishment message they were carrying forth, and it fed into some of the ideology of those that took a stand against Vietnam and those that were on board with a drug culture, make love, not war. But today, our kids are more educated and aware. They listen to the meaning of the lyrics. They're into the relationship and the connection, not so much with the artist and not so much with the what we would call the category or the genre of the music. They're interested in the message and the relationship conveyed in the message, and can they identify with the message? And you need to become familiar with that message in this new book, Rock Gets Religion, The Battle for the Soul of the Devil's Music. Mark Joseph, thank you so much for sharing this story with us here on Revealing the Truth.
Great to be with you and your viewers.
Thank you so much. And that brings to an end our live broadcast day, but that doesn't mean we go off the air. You can watch us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week through our portal at ignitinganation.com. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and on LinkedIn. And until we see you back here in the studio live tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock a.m. Central Standard Time from our studios here in Birmingham, Alabama, we bid you shalom.